Some murders leave behind blood. Others leave behind fingerprints, witnesses, or a trail investigators can follow. But every so often, a case appears that seems to reject every rule detectives have spent their careers relying on. A person vanishes from an ordinary life, their body is eventually found, and every answer that should exist simply doesn't. No clear suspect, no believable motive, no evidence strong enough to explain why an ordinary day ended in an extraordinary tragedy. For years, investigators returned to the same files, studied the same photographs, replayed the same interviews, and asked the same question over and over again. How could someone be murdered without leaving behind a story that made sense? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There are crimes that become famous because they are violent. Others are remembered because they reveal astonishing deception. Then there are the rare cases that continue haunting investigators because the truth refuses to fit together, even after years of relentless work. Today's story is one of those cases. It begins in a quiet American community where neighbors believed they knew one another, where children rode bicycles through peaceful streets, and where the worst headlines usually involved traffic accidents or storms. Nobody imagined that their town would soon become the focus of national attention after a murder that challenged experienced detectives, divided public opinion, and raised questions that remained unanswered long after the investigation began. At first, the evidence seemed straightforward. But the closer investigators looked, the less sense it made. Every promising lead dissolved into uncertainty, every convincing theory collapsed under scrutiny, and every person connected to the victim appeared to be hiding something, even if that secret had nothing to do with murder. The deeper the investigation went, the more complicated the truth became. More than a quarter of a century has passed, yet people still argue about what really happened inside that large family home on the morning after Christmas. Some believe the answer has always been obvious. Others are convinced the real killer was overlooked during the confusion of the first few hours. Detectives followed thousands of leads, examined mountains of evidence, interviewed countless witnesses, and spent years trying to separate fact from rumor. Even today, advances in forensic science continue to fuel hopes that modern DNA testing could finally identify the person responsible, but no one has ever been charged with the murder. To understand why this case became one of America's most debated murder investigations, we have to begin long before investigators arrived at the house. Imagine a family that, from the outside, appeared to have everything. In this documentary, we'll call them the Anderson family. Michael Anderson was a successful businessman whose company had brought financial security beyond what most people could imagine. His wife, Rebecca, devoted much of her time to raising their 2 children and supporting local charities. Their youngest daughter, Emily, was known throughout the community for her bright personality and success in children's beauty competitions. Friends described her as energetic, polite, and always eager to perform. Their home stood in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city, and every December it became a gathering place filled with holiday decorations, laughter, and relatives. Looking at family photographs, it was difficult to imagine that within hours, those same rooms would become the center of one of the most controversial murder investigations in modern American history. Christmas Day had unfolded much like countless others. The Anderson family attended a holiday gathering, exchanged gifts, visited friends, and returned home late in the evening. Nothing about their schedule appeared extraordinary. Their daughter was reportedly tired after a full day of celebrations and was carried upstairs to bed. Her parents later said they expected the next morning to be filled with packing for another family trip. Instead, before sunrise, Rebecca walked downstairs and discovered a handwritten ransom note lying on the staircase. It claimed their daughter had been kidnapped and demanded a large sum of money. Panic replaced celebration in an instant. Emergency services were called, friends arrived to help, and officers entered the home believing they were responding to an abduction. Nobody realized that the truth waiting inside the house would soon transform a missing child investigation into a murder case that would fascinate the world for decades. Hours after officers entered the Anderson home, the investigation took a turn that nobody expected. Instead of focusing entirely on finding a kidnapped child, attention shifted back to the house itself. As the morning wore on, investigators began noticing small details that didn't seem to fit the story described in the ransom note. The note itself was unusually long, far longer than most ransom demands seen by experienced investigators. Its language appeared carefully written, almost theatrical at times, and some phrases seemed oddly familiar, reminding experts of lines from popular movies. The amount of money demanded also raised eyebrows because it closely resembled a recent work-related bonus Michael Anderson had received, a figure that was unlikely to be known by a complete stranger. None of these observations proved anything on their own, but together they created an uncomfortable question that investigators could not ignore. If an outsider had committed the crime, how had that person known so much about the family? And if someone inside the home had written the note, what could possibly explain such an unimaginable act? Those questions would define the investigation for years to come. As officers continued searching the property, Michael made a discovery that changed everything. Inside a little-used room in the basement, he found Emily's body. What had begun as a kidnapping investigation instantly became a homicide investigation, and from that moment forward, every decision made during those first chaotic hours came under intense scrutiny. Detectives later acknowledged that the home had not been secured according to the standards expected for a potential murder scene. Friends, relatives, and other visitors had moved throughout the house, unintentionally disturbing areas that might have contained valuable evidence. Forensic specialists would later recover physical evidence, including DNA from the child's clothing, but interpreting what it meant proved extraordinarily difficult. Some experts believed it pointed toward an unknown intruder, while others argued it could have been transferred innocently during manufacturing or handling. Rather than bringing clarity, each new scientific finding seemed to deepen the disagreement surrounding the case. Public attention soon exploded beyond anything local investigators could have imagined. Television networks covered the story almost nonstop. Newspapers printed new theories every week, and millions of people began forming opinions long before all the evidence had been examined. Some were convinced the killer had entered the home from outside, pointing to possible entry routes and unidentified DNA. Others believed the truth lay within the family itself, questioning inconsistencies in interviews and the unusual circumstances surrounding the ransom note. Detectives conducted extensive interviews, sought handwriting analysis, examined phone records, and followed thousands of tips from across the United States and beyond. Every promising lead seemed to end the same way, with more uncertainty than answers. The deeper investigators looked, the more the case appeared to resist every attempt to explain it. What should have been a straightforward search for one killer became a maze of competing theories, incomplete evidence, and unanswered questions that continue to divide investigators, forensic experts, and the public decades later. As the years passed, the investigation entered a phase that many detectives quietly admit is the most frustrating of all. The urgency of the first few weeks had faded, witnesses, memories had begun to blur, and every piece of evidence had already been examined countless times. Yet no matter how many times the files were reopened, investigators kept returning to the same troubling question. Was the answer hidden in plain sight, or had the crucial clue been lost forever during those first chaotic hours? New detectives assigned to the case approached it with fresh eyes, hoping they would notice something everyone else had overlooked. They rebuilt timelines, reviewed thousands of pages of reports, compared forensic findings with advances in modern science, and even revisited witnesses who had been interviewed years earlier. Each review uncovered small inconsistencies, but none were enough to identify a killer beyond reasonable doubt. It was as though the case had been carefully designed to leave investigators permanently trapped between two competing explanations, neither of which could be fully proven. John Benet Ramsey's case has remained officially unsolved despite decades of investigation and periodic reviews using newer forensic techniques. One of the greatest sources of debate became the physical evidence itself. Forensic science is often portrayed as providing immediate and unquestionable answers, but experienced investigators know reality is rarely that simple. DNA, fingerprints, handwriting analysis, and trace evidence all require careful interpretation, especially in a home where many people had legitimate reasons to be present. The unidentified DNA recovered from the victim's clothing became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the entire case. Some investigators viewed it as a compelling indication that someone outside the family had been involved. Others cautioned that modern forensic science has shown how tiny amounts of DNA can be transferred through everyday manufacturing, packaging, or innocent contact, making interpretation far more complicated than television dramas often suggest. Because of those uncertainties, the DNA has never been enough by itself to identify or eliminate a single suspect with complete confidence. Instead of settling the debate, it became another reason why experts continue to disagree about what truly happened inside that house. Perhaps the most haunting part of this story is that every major theory appears to answer some questions while creating entirely new ones. If an intruder entered the home, how did that person avoid leaving behind clearer evidence and remain undetected for so long? If someone within the household was responsible, how do investigators explain the forensic findings that have never been conclusively linked to any family member? These unanswered questions have kept the case alive for nearly 3 decades, inspiring books, documentaries, podcasts, and endless public discussion. Advances in DNA technology continue to offer hope that evidence once considered too limited may someday reveal new information, and investigators have repeatedly stated that they remain willing to pursue credible leads as forensic methods improve. Whether that breakthrough will finally provide the answers that have eluded detectives for so many years remains unknown. What is certain is that this case transformed the way many law enforcement agencies approach homicide investigations, crime scene preservation, and the careful handling of forensic evidence, leaving a legacy that extends far beyond the tragedy itself. There is something deeply unsettling about cases like this because they force us to confront a reality that many people would rather not accept. We often believe that every crime leaves behind a clear trail, that every mystery eventually reaches a satisfying conclusion, and that modern science can solve almost anything if investigators simply work hard enough. But this investigation challenged those assumptions from the very beginning. It demonstrated that even with enormous resources, national attention, and decades of forensic advancements, the truth can remain just out of reach. Every new development generated headlines suggesting the mystery was finally about to be solved, only for those expectations to fade when the evidence failed to produce the certainty everyone had hoped for. Families waited for answers, investigators carried the weight of unfinished work, and the public continued asking the same question that had echoed since the day the crime was discovered. Who was responsible, and why has the answer remained so difficult to prove? That question has become almost as famous as the case itself, reminding us that some investigations are remembered not because they were solved, but because they continue challenging everything we think we know about justice. John Bennett Ramsey's murder remains an open case, and authorities have continued to review evidence as forensic methods evolve. Over the years, investigators received thousands of tips from people claiming they had the missing piece of the puzzle. Some callers insisted they knew the killer. Others claimed to have witnessed suspicious behavior years earlier, but had never reported it. There were individuals seeking attention, people motivated by financial reward, and others who genuinely believed they could help. Detectives patiently followed lead after lead, comparing statements against established timelines, forensic evidence, and documented facts. Almost every promising tip eventually reached the same disappointing conclusion. It either conflicted with verified evidence or simply could not be supported by independent investigation. That endless cycle illustrates one of the greatest challenges in high-profile murder cases. Public interest generates valuable information, but it also creates an overwhelming volume of misinformation that investigators must carefully separate from credible evidence. In this case, the sheer number of theories became a problem in itself. Each new speculation distracted attention from the verified facts, making it increasingly difficult for the public to distinguish established evidence from rumor. Perhaps the greatest lesson from this story is not about one investigation, one family, or even one unsolved murder. It is about the limits of certainty. Every major theory surrounding this case has supporters who believe the evidence clearly points in one direction, while equally experienced investigators and forensic specialists argue the opposite. Until evidence emerges that can withstand rigorous scientific and legal scrutiny, the case remains officially unsolved, and that distinction matters. In the pursuit of justice, suspicion alone is never enough. Facts must be proven, evidence must withstand examination, and conclusions must be supported beyond reasonable doubt. That standard protects innocent people while ensuring that the real offender, if identified, can be held accountable. As forensic science continues to advance, investigators remain hopeful that technology unavailable in the 1990s may someday provide the breakthrough that has remained elusive for nearly 3 decades. Until then, this tragedy stands as one of America's most enduring murder mysteries, a case that continues to remind investigators, journalists, and the public alike that sometimes the most difficult question is not whether a crime occurred, but whether the complete truth can ever be known. If this case made you question everything you thought you knew about criminal investigations, you're not alone. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Based on the evidence that has been made public, what do you think happened inside that house that Christmas night? Do you believe the answer has been hiding in plain sight all these years, or is there still a crucial piece of the puzzle waiting to be discovered? If you enjoyed this documentary and want more carefully researched true crime stories that examine the evidence rather than the rumors, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. In our next story, we'll examine another real case that left investigators searching for answers long after the headlines faded, proving once again that truth is often far more complex than it first appears.